Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in to our very first listening party, which we're calling Bravethrough Live. My name is Scott Nishimoto, and I'm the Executive Director of Seeds of Peace. We're a nonprofit organization whose mission is to raise peace-building leaders. And we do so through a number of different platforms where youth and educators and parents and general community members learn about peace-building practices and then launch action plans to build peace within, build peace with others, and build peace in service to the community. On behalf of our partners, the Institute for Climate and Peace, the Matsunaga Institute for Peace, the Peace Studio, and KTUH Honolulu, we're really excited for the next hour, and we're really grateful that you all made the time to tune in. So what is Bravethrough Live? This is a live session to talk story about the first 2 episodes of Dr. Maya Soetoro's new podcast called Bravethrough. Each month, we're planning to stream Bravethrough Live so we can dive a little deeper into the topics discussed in the Bravethrough podcast episodes. Our hope is that this gives our community opportunities to ask questions and interact with Maya and her guests in ways that you weren't able to while listening to a pre-recorded podcast. Here's an opportunity to ask. Throw those questions into the Facebook live stream comment section, and we'll try our best to get to them in the time we have. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Maya Soetoro. Maya is the link that holds our partnership together. She's the co-founder of Seeds of Peace. She's the co-founder of the Institute for Climate and Peace, and she's the co-founder of the Peace Studio, while also serving as a consultant to the Obama Foundation and a faculty at the Matsunaga Institute. And if that didn't keep her busy enough, she's also an author, she's a mentor, she's a volunteer, and she's also an amazing auntie and mom. So Maya, the floor is yours.
Thank you, beloved Scott, and thank you, Zephanie and Ari, and our guests today, and our partners. I'm so grateful for the opportunity to work with you all to create these conversations and to bring them into the community. In creating this series, I did think a lot about the importance of challenging seemingly intractable problems. And I feel that our guests here today and the guests that will come really do help us look with fresh eyes and newly determined spirit to see if we can learn how to do things a little more imaginatively and then bravely take action toward a more just and peaceful series of outcomes and a beloved community that is fair and thoughtful and engaged. So in the series premiere, these past months, we heard from Liam Chinn and James Koshiba. Liam spoke about reimagining public safety and redefining home, and James spoke about houselessness and the importance and possibility of creating family and community from the ground up. For those of you who haven't heard the full conversations yet, please do go listen when you can, but we'll hear some of the conversation today. And allow me to briefly introduce these guests and start the evening off by having you meet these incredible people. Liam Chinn was raised in a native Alaskan community where he was inspired by community there. For 20 years, he's worked locally and in more than a dozen countries, developing initiatives that advance self-determination and healing, especially in communities that have been fractured by violence or oppression. He's currently a community safety and police reform consultant appointed by the City of Oakland in 2020 to serve as the co-chair of the Alternate Responses and Investments Advisory Board, which is part of the city's Reimagining Public Safety Task Force. Prior to this, he served as a founding executive director of Restore Oakland, a restorative justice and job training center that's a model for reinvestment and healing in low-income communities of color, some of them devastated by mass incarceration. For nearly a decade, he also served with the Asia Foundation, where he led a groundbreaking pilot program in the war-torn country of Timor-Leste. And this one shifts in policies away from militarized policing and toward nationwide community-led restorative justice system. And I'd also like to introduce James Koshiba, who in 2015, frustrated by the explosion of homelessness in Hawaii and the dwindling compassion for those who were houseless, pitched a tent in a large urban encampment and started forging relationships with people who were experiencing homelessness for a wide variety of reasons. He became a supporter and a student of Pu'uhonua o Waianae. This is a self-organized village of more than 250 people living unhoused at the Waianae Boat Harbor. Through these relationships and careful listening and deep feeling, he began to understand homelessness as a problem of severed connections with family and community. And he co-founded Hui Aloha to demonstrate how rebuilding community with those who are marginalized is really key to solving a persistent and wide array of social problems, including homelessness. Today, Hui Aloha partners with people on the street. They launch service projects in their communities. They reconnect house neighbors to the houseless, to help both parties know each other's stories and feel that sense of connection and healing and purpose together. Also helping to build affordable housing for those who cannot afford it. And this is, of course, an enormous problem in Hawaii, where the gap between housing costs and wages is devastating and enormous. Prior to Hui Aloha, James co-founded and was executive director of Kanu Hawaii, which worked to build movements for sustainability and help people to determinedly step into a sense of civic engagement and kuleana. He was born and raised on Oahu in Hawaii. He did spend some time on the continent, earning degrees from Brown University and Harvard Kennedy School. So now, having introduced you to these gentlemen, I'd like to share 10 minutes from each of their episodes, and we'll have 20 minutes of listening together. And afterwards, I look forward to your Q&A, and we will talk story. Mahalo.
Work here in the U.S.
Let's talk about Oakland for a second. Oakland's long been a center for social justice work. Can you tell us a little bit more about how the work on reimagining policing and public safety came to be a part of Oakland's charge?
Yeah, so in the wake of George Floyd's death, the City of Oakland passed legislation to form a task force that had the specific mandate to lay out in detail what it would look like to reduce the police budget by 50% and redirect that money into alternatives to policing and investments in root causes of crime and violence. So this was a really unique opportunity that came in the wake of the tragedy of George Floyd that brought together a wide diversity of people from across Oakland, people that represented a number of different professional backgrounds, as well as lived experience, including formerly incarcerated folks and people that have experienced police brutality on a day-to-day basis.
I'm pleased to learn that so many folks stepped up and were willing to do the uncomfortable work of participating in that process of change. What was the experience like for you, and what was perhaps most surprising or inspiring about it?
You know, I think what was most surprising were just the amount of common sense and brilliant solutions that are out there to address the ongoing public safety challenges that we've seen. Whether it's how to deal with people having mental health crises, homelessness, people in particular, whether it's how to deal with traffic enforcement, and a whole host of other issues. Just the number of solutions that were brought to the table by community members, which, as I mentioned, had a diversity of backgrounds, from criminal justice reform experts to mental health professionals to traffic enforcement experts to just moms from the community who said, you know, we've experienced a lot of pain and anguish, and we want to help to address some of these problems that seem to just never go away.
So this was a task force to reimagine. public safety and policing. Can you talk a little bit about the difference between reimagination and reform?
I think that's such a key question. And I think it can be answered with the question is, do we want to continue to make tweaks to police policies in the hopes that we're going to produce a drastically different outcome, which, by the way, we've been doing for decades? The idea of more training and continued police reform is not new. You can literally go back to the 1960s and look at the sort of dialogue and narrative that was happening at that time in response to widespread police brutality. And it's almost like you could cut and paste it to what we're hearing today. What I like to point out is that in Minneapolis, where George Floyd was murdered, a couple of years before that, there was another murder of an African-American man that in the wake of it, new reforms were passed that, for example, required an officer to intervene if he saw one of his fellow officers using excessive force. But none of these things made a difference in saving George Floyd's life. And we see that over and over again. So when we think about reimagining, in contrast, we think about what would it look like to address the root causes of crime and violence? What would it look like to not talk about reforming police, but to talk about actually redefining the role that police play in society, and to really think about what does safety really mean? What really brings safety? Is it more policing? Do we know of any community in the United States where more policing resulted in more safety, more opportunity, and a more thriving and healthy community? I personally can't think of one. So I think it comes down to this sort of simple quote that I heard someone say recently, which is, the safest communities are not the ones with the most police, they're the ones with the most resources.
And I can see how reforms perhaps don't work and can't be the true pathway forward for meaningful change because they don't necessarily address mindset and cultural change and therefore don't address the root causes of violence, right? I'd love to ask you what you think true safety means. And are there countries out there that are safer than ours in your estimation?
So true safety, as I mentioned, really comes from having your basic needs met. We can not make it overly complicated and just say, what factors, what conditions exist in communities that currently have a high level of safety? So in other words, middle class, upper middle class, and wealthy communities. Why are they safer? Well, clearly basic needs are being met. Living wage jobs, stable housing, cleaner environment, good education, healthy food, and so on. So when we think about safety, why do we not tie it to those factors that we know are proven over and over, not just by common sense and looking at these communities that exist right next door to communities that are suffering, but also proven through data. But in the United States, we've sort of created this false narrative that more policing and more incarceration brings safety, and it's just not true.
There's so many practical considerations and therefore solutions that this work brings to the surface, and yet so many people think of the work that you are doing as idealistic but unrealistic work. What should our listeners say to critics who say, you know what, this is all well and good in theory, but basically impossible to achieve, true safety without a robust police force?
I would say to that, look at the current situation. The definition of insanity is to continue the same approach over and over and expect a different result. And as I said earlier, making tweaks to police policy and expecting drastically different outcomes is just not going to be the case. We have to look at the current situation as the outcome of a strategy that has been tried for decades and just hasn't worked. And reimagining and asking what are the root causes of crime and violence is actually hyper-practical. It grounds us in data. It grounds us in clear evidence of what works, such as economic opportunity, living wage jobs, versus relying on an idea that if we would just police more, if we would just punish and arrest more people and put more people in jail and have more police presence on the street, that would create a different outcome, despite the fact that the data and all research generally shows otherwise. So to the people that say reimagining just isn't realistic, I understand that. I understand why it's hard for people to see something in a different way. It's been this way in our country for centuries. But I think the evidence is right in front of us. And I think, for example, when we talk about what is the right way to respond to someone having a mental health crisis, is it to send an armed police officer, or is it to send a crisis counselor and an EMT who can actually de-escalate the situation and give the person the care that they need, and then refer them on to a continuum of care? So I think those are the kind of questions we have to ask ourselves. Does it require a gun and a badge to give someone a speeding ticket or to reprimand someone who went through a stop sign? Do we need to send police into homeless encampments to enforce cleanup crews being able to do their jobs? When you start to actually break it down, I think people see the impracticality of having police do all of these different jobs. And by the way, in defensive police, they don't want to be doing these jobs. That's not what they signed up for. You know, friends of mine that are police say, hey, we've been asked to take on all of these societal failures, from dealing with substance abuse, from dealing with domestic violence, to dealing with homelessness, and so on, and truancy, police in schools, right? Enforcing and policing children. This is a sort of mission creep that has gotten totally out of control. And I think we as Americans just sort of sat back and let it happen. But police themselves would rather be fighting violent crime. They would rather narrow their mission. Of course, in order to do that, we need to bring on the appropriate professionals who are trained to deal with things like mental health crises. But that requires funding. So if police want to no longer do these duties, they have to accept that we need to redirect a certain amount of funding in order to make that switch. But again, this is hyper practical.
So part of what...
Right, sorry for that cliffhanger, but you're gonna have to listen to the rest of the episode on your own. That was a 10-minute clip from episode 1 of the podcast featuring Liam Chinn. We're now going to move on to a 10-minute clip from episode 2 featuring James Koshiba.
Can you give us a little more, information or some stories about people in the village that help us to understand perhaps what brought them there, their struggles and strengths?
Mm-hmm. Sure. I was thinking about this actually, and it's funny, if you meet a person for the first time who is houseless and you ask them, why are you out here, or what brought you out here? You'll often get responses like, oh, I'm out here by choice, or I made bad decisions, or I'm not a good person, I'm just an ex-con, or I'm a junkie or a chronic, that's why I'm out here. But as you get to know folks and you dig a little deeper into the stories, you can see both the deeply personal and also systemic reasons why people end up on the street. So a couple of examples, I was thinking about a friend of mine. He's not from the village. He lives in Waimanalo Beach Park, or used to live in Waimanalo Beach Park. I had asked him this question, why are you out here? And he gave me the answer of, well, I'm a chronic. I've been using for many years, and that's why I'm here. And as I got to know him better, he shared with me that he had lost his son, who was 3 years old at the time, a decade ago. And his son had drowned while they were at the beach, and he blamed himself for his son's death. He never forgave himself. It destroyed his family. And it was after that he started using. That was his way of medicating. It's not as simple as, well, I'm just a chronic. That's why I'm here. People that say, well, I'm choosing it. You dig a little deeper, and you find out that, well, when we first got evicted from our house, we tried to go to a shelter. If you've never spent time in a shelter, if you've never tried to stay in a shelter, you'd be surprised by the conditions in shelter. They're really difficult places to manage, so this is not at all a pointing fingers at the folks who operate shelters, but you try to imagine 300 people crammed into a warehouse, no privacy, bed bugs, and there are people in there that have serious challenges. You might be bunked up right next to someone that has a serious mental illness, or has a deep addiction, or is coming out of their deep addiction. And it can be itself a traumatic experience for folks. On top of that, most people don't realize that many shelters require you to be out of the shelter during the day. So you can sleep there. You have to be in before 7 p.m. You can spend the night there, but you have to be out by 7 a.m. So you spend the whole day outdoors anyway, and then you come back in to sleep. So it's a pretty challenging situation. And if you've been on the street for any amount of time, with all your belongings, maybe you have a pet, maybe you have a partner, or some people that you're close to that you trust, you can't go into a shelter as a group. You go in as an individual, you get placed wherever there's space. You can take the equivalent of 2 suitcases full of belongings, and that's it. So you have to leave a lot of your stuff behind. Most shelters don't allow pets. And for many folks on the street, pets are like family. And so it's a big decision to go into a shelter. And then you have 90 days in a shelter typically to find housing, or for them to help you find housing. And as you know, there's just not enough truly affordable housing in Hawaii. I mean, as you pointed out, we're living in one of the most expensive housing markets in the nation, in the world, where competition for space is fierce. And so people exhaust their 90 days and they'll end up back out on the street. And they'll be worse off than before because now they don't have their pet, their connections, their belongings. So when someone says, well, I'm choosing to be here, there's that kind of story behind it too.
It's so much more complex than people understand. And people do, I think, in their minds, oversimplify this issue. And that's part of the bias that comes in, and part of the challenge of building and finding solutions, because what you described to me, I can see would not work for many people. I want to ask about the pandemic and what has been the hardest part of working with these communities and dealing with the attendant challenges in building community and family at a time of separation and distance.
Sure. Well, there were a couple of kind of macro things that were happening during the pandemic that caused a lot more people to end up on the street, right? So despite the eviction moratorium, people were being evicted, especially folks that were in sort of tenuous housing situations to begin with. In Hawaii, we've got a lot of families that are doubled or tripled up in one home. Not everyone is on the lease necessarily. And so landlords, once the pandemic hit, they really wanted to, people were afraid of disease spreading. So, they were trying to thin out the number of people in homes, and families themselves, if they had maybe welcomed in, other people to stay in a pretty crowded situation, were also afraid. So a lot of those folks lost their housing during the pandemic. You had shelters that were trying to decrowd during the pandemic. And so the capacity of shelters, there's already not enough shelter space for folks in the islands. And so a lot of folks were discharged from shelter. The same thing was happening in jails and prisons. You had them trying to decrowd. And so any nonviolent offenders were getting early release. There's not a good system. There wasn't before the pandemic, and there isn't now a good system for helping people transition from incarceration back into community or even a stable, living situation. So a lot of those folks went straight from jail out into the street. So you had encampments swelling. And we were seeing it as we did our outreach and community building on the street. The positive side of the pandemic was people really did pull together. I mean, the community, both our houseless neighbors on the street and housed people really stepped up. And the generosity of the people of Hawaii was on full display. People were coming down, helping feed folks during the pandemic, providing things like hygiene supplies. We saw, just a lot more of that kind of activity. And then folks that were living on the street also did their part. I mean, one of the first things that the city did at the time, the city and county of Honolulu did at the time, the early days of the pandemic, was they closed all the parks and they shut down all of the public restrooms. Where there were gates, they locked up the bathrooms. If there weren't gates, they boarded them up. And that caused a panic on the street because folks were they're like, where are we going to use the bathroom? There's a pandemic. We can't even wash our hands and stay clean now. Is their only source of fresh water a lot of times for people living in parks. And so we went to the city and said, this is not only inhumane, but you're creating a public health hazard here. What's it going to take to get the bathrooms reopened? And they said, well, we just don't have the staff and the supplies to keep the bathrooms clean during the pandemic. That's what we're afraid of. So we went back out to our houseless friends and said, look, we know that even before the pandemic, a lot of you were the ones cleaning the bathrooms. if we can get donated supplies, cleaning supplies, would you be willing to form teams and clean the bathrooms and sanitize them on at least a daily basis? And they stepped up and did that. We got at its peak, we called them bathroom brigades. There are more than a dozen bathroom brigades, teams of people in parks across the island who were cleaning and sanitizing the bathrooms every day. So the city agreed to reopen the bathrooms. We had those brigades going. So just another example of how people were really stepping up to do their part during the pandemic. To be honest, the most challenging part was dealing with government. The government response was reactionary. It ended up being punitive. Enforcement actions in parks increased during the pandemic. People were getting cited for being inside of their tent without a mask. Each of those citations had a mandatory court appearance. And if you miss a court date, then that's, a bench warrant for arrest. And so people were getting sent to jail. A lot of folks in encampments were being sent to jail for park violations, for mask violations, and then coming back out and losing everything. I mean, even some of our bathroom brigade volunteers who were going into the parks to clean the bathrooms were getting cited as they were going into the park to clean the bathroom or coming out of the park after having cleaned the bathroom. And then during enforcement actions, they would have all of their cleaning supplies taken, confiscated, because that's what happens during a quote unquote sweep during these enforcement actions. And so the community was rallying to provide these donated cleaning supplies and materials. And then, the next day we'd show up and it'd all be gone. It had been confiscated. And so it felt like a battle throughout definitely the early months of the pandemic, just to allow the community to respond and contribute in the way that the community was willing to do. Both, again, house donors and supporters and houseless folks on the street trying to do their part. It's better now. It is better now, but it was a slog
that
to figure out a way to work with government.
Really difficult. Mm-hmm. And you're bringing.
All right. Sorry again for the awkward cliffhanger. But you folks are gonna have to listen to the episode yourself. You can find it on SoundCloud as well as the Apple Podcast platform. If you search KTOH Honolulu, you should be able to see it. But at the end of the episode, definitely will give more specific information on how to access these episodes. But yeah, as you could imagine, it was very difficult to choose a 10-minute segment from each of these brilliant interviews. Just really, really brilliant information, very thoughtful stories. And Maya, I think you facilitated it perfectly. So thank you folks so much. We're gonna reserve the last 30 minutes of this hour for question and answer. And I wanted to start off with you, Maya, with just a simple question. What is the purpose of the Bravethrough series?
Thank you, Scott, for the question and for facilitating this conversation. So basically, all of the interviewees, past and future, have taught me a lot. They are people who have helped me to wash my eyes, as I often say, and to see things in new way, to see the moment, this time, our communities, my own responsibility and mindset and heart, to see all of that with refreshed gaze, to see solutions and problems and community in poetic ways. And so each of these conversations is designed to kind of help the listeners go on a journey. And the journey is about bringing together sort of past, present, and future, understanding where we've been, how we've done things a particular way, where we are, the opportunities before us, and the future that we need to step into bravely. Hence, brave through. It's obviously a play on words that we're thinking about breakthrough ideas and wisdom. We're thinking about breaking through the walls that we erect in both mind and spirit, and between each other, right? And so the idea is to look at the issues of the day in creative new ways, and there's enormous innovation that it is evidenced by the solutions and the voice that our guests share. And these conversations, though, are just a starting place. The idea is to ignite more conversations, to have sustained dialogue. And as people start shifting their mindset, hopefully igniting that sense of curiosity and getting listeners to begin taking action in their communities and inspire learning and courage in others, and help them become part of our family, and begin sharing strategies and teaching the broader community. So the hope is to create a lot of Bravethrough actions and individuals who identify themselves in brave new ways.
Thanks so much, Maya. I think the title of the podcast kind of sums up the spirit behind it perfectly. We're going to jump over to Liam. Liam, your question is, what are some of the biggest misconceptions or myths about police and public safety?
Yeah, I think this is a critical question, because I think it's one of the primary reasons why in the United States we have consistently given 50% of our local government budgets towards policing. Police get the lion's share of local budgets, and tend to be growing every year during a time when social services and other programs are cut. And it's also, one of the reasons why it's been so hard to hold police accountable. So some of those myths that underpin what I believe are a sort of a blind reverence for law and order in America. One of those myths is how police spend their time. If you watch American television, if you were to watch even the news, your assumption would be that police spend the majority of their time fighting violent crime. But that's actually really far from the truth. Only 4% of 911 calls are for violent crime. So another way to say that is 96% of calls tend to be nonviolent, generally lower level offenses, whether it's a noise complaint, whether it's a unsheltered person sleeping in a doorway, and so on and so on. So I think that's a critical kind of fact that we're still trying to help people understand about how do police really spend their time, because it really, again, that underpins the rationale of why we need to start sort of unbundling all of these duties that police have and to bringing them out to appropriate professionals. Another myth that's really quite, I would say it's kind of taboo to say, but the myth is that police are police are good at solving crime. They're actually not good at solving crime if you judge it by the amount of cases that are actually solved. So, for example, in Hawaii, 75% of all violent crime goes unsolved. In places like Oakland, about 60 to 70% of all homicides go unsolved. Less than 5% of property crimes get solved. So let me say that again, that 95% of property crimes go unsolved by police. And this is, again, despite police getting by far the lion's share of local government budget. So the FBI has a database where they actually collect clearance rate data from local police departments across the country, and in general, police have not been effective at solving crime. A couple more quick ones is, and this is an important one, is that's a myth that seems to be perpetuated, is that their lives are in imminent danger, that their job is incredibly dangerous, and that any moment a police officer could be killed. Actually, each year in the United States, about 49 police are attacked and killed. That's definitely 49 too many. We don't want to see any of our brothers and sisters in blue losing their lives. But taken into context, it doesn't even fall into the top 20 most dangerous jobs in America. And I don't say that because I'm trying to demean or diminish the important job that police do, which is incredibly stressful and difficult. But the reason that I bring up this myth is that we are living in an era where police are now habitually using preemptive fatal force when they perceive any sense of danger. So the case of Dante Wright, the young man who died recently, actually during the around the George Floyd trial, for the Derek Chauvin trial, a young man was pulled over by the Minneapolis Police Department for a routine traffic violation. He was unarmed, but a struggle ensued, and in the end, he was executed by the cop. So this is just to say that these are some big myths that seem to perpetuate our law and order culture. There's a couple of more if we have time. I'll come back to, but I'll stop there.
Great, thank you so much, Liam. Appreciate it. We're going to move on to James, and we're going to ask a question from the audience over Facebook. This person works with the houseless community on the medical side of things. And this person asked if you could speak a little bit about what doesn't work, what does not work. And this person was telling us that there are many policy attempts to help that were good intention, but didn't fully address the root issue or meet the needs of those they're trying to serve.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. And thanks to Maya and the whole Seeds of Peace team for giving us the space to talk about these issues. I think the question from the audience is on the money, in that we have learned a lot about what doesn't work over the course of the last decade. We've invested resources into creating temporary space for people, shelters, vouchers that last for 1 to 2 years. We've put a lot into sort of punitive approaches to homelessness, so criminalizing sitting or lying on sidewalks and being in public parks after hours. And we've pushed a system. This doesn't come back to any one individual, but it comes back to systemic forces, which we can talk more about. But we've pushed an approach to homelessness, which is essentially, even on the service provider side, been focused about ushering people into temporary shelter as quickly as possible, getting them off the streets without enough attention to where is a trusting relationship built between service provider and person on the street, and then what is the long-term solution for folks, since they can only stay in shelter on average 90 days. And maybe the last piece of that is that in the places that we have created, either for temporary space or for longer term space, and in terms of long-term space, there's not enough long-term space for people. But where we have been able to create those spaces, they tend to be isolated in and of themselves. I mean, they tend to be pushed outside of actual neighborhoods. They tend to be in places without good access to infrastructure or jobs or transportation. And so all of those things have the effect of actually deepening people's isolation and alienation. And that comes, I think in my mind and in what we've learned through the work of Hui Aloha and partnering with folks on the street, that is at the core of solving this problem, is we've got to re-knit community back together and be working against that isolation and alienation. When you're on the street, and if you're looking to improve your situation, it has to start first and foremost with a sense of hope and someone you feel you can trust. Because you end up on the street because you've been let down by a lot of people, and you may have been let down by every institution you've turned to, and that's how you end up on the street. And so that sense of hope starts with encountering someone that you feel like you can build a sense of trust with and a supportive relationship. And those aspects of our system, the kind of transactional and temporary nature, the pushing people into isolated pockets, those all work again, and punishing people, of course, kind of all work against the fundamental first step in helping people progress beyond the situation that they're in.
Thanks so much for sharing, James. Yeah, hope and trust, those are two things that I think many of us who have not had to live through houselessness probably take for granted. So yeah, thanks for sharing that. Jumping back over to Liam, it's a great question from Kathy. She's an elementary school teacher who raised 2 sons who are now adults. And she said, in an era of cops and robbers and cowboy and Indian child's play, where there were incorrect, clear lines of good against bad, white against black, my question is, are there tools that intentionally redirect how children, especially boys, view police and their role in society without making officers wrong or lessening their positive authority in society?
Yeah, I think that's a tough question. Like, I'm not aware of any specific tools, but I think it's important to engage our kids in what it means to be safe, right? Does safety come from the visual presence of having police on the streets, or when we look at communities that are doing better, when we don't actually see police very often, what we see are healthy communities. We see living wage jobs, and we see people with stable housing and fresh food. So I think helping our kids to understand that that safety is not something that police necessarily that police themselves are directly associated with, and that police should be something that we call upon in those rare cases of violent crimes where we do need police to step in and we do need their abilities and so forth. But to answer the question, I'm not aware of any tools. What I would say though is I think it depends on what community the children come from. My experience in engaging with, for example, with Black communities in Oakland is unfortunately, in many cases, parents have to talk to their kids about how they engage police simply because of the danger that young Black males face in engaging police. And that they always say Black parents teach their children to immediately stick your hands outside the window of the car, don't reach for anything in the glove compartment. So unfortunately, those are actually the tools that are out there. But I think that's a great question, and I wish I had a more definitive answer.
Well, and if I may just add to those very important points, Liam, I think, and thank you, Kathy, for the question. I do think that part of it is, helping our kids to understand that there's more than a single story about everyone, and just if you look at the both victims and perpetrators of violence around this issue, just having the courage to connect with kids and ask questions and look beyond the role, the mythologies, and about also those who suffer violence at the hands of police, right? So I think just looking at our communities, developing a strength-based approach with our frontline communities, helping children to feel a sense of pride and to understand the full beauty and bounty of these communities that are struggling the most. I think that a lot of what we also need to do is look at stories of the incarcerated or formerly incarcerated and help to, in every instance, kind of deeply rehumanize and help to heal traumas that are intergenerational, in many communities, unfortunately, and the children can't be spared these challenging conversations about how many of our beautiful young people have been harmed and need, and are in need of healing too. And so a lot of flooding with love and new recognition, I think, is a valuable tool.
Thanks, Liam, and thanks, Maya. One thing I just wanted to add is, Seeds of Peace is working on a toolkit right now, which we hope may have some tools and activities that may address this directly. Looking very critically at certain narratives that we've become so accustomed to, the cowboys and Indians and the cops and robbers. There are activities out there for youth to think really critically about those narratives. So that was a little bit of a shameless plug for something that we're working on at Seeds. But be on the lookout for that. I'm gonna jump right back to James. We have a question from Yoko Urbane from Tokyo, our friend Yoko. How's it going, Yoko? And she asked, does Hawaii's government make special efforts for homeless folks to find a place to stay for a long time with assurance during the 90 days? Housing is so costly in Hawaii.
I think there have been some efforts more recently that's been kind of a shift in the public policy approach, I think, is to look at the longer term versus emergency shelter. But the emphasis is still on temporary fixes. And I think part of that is historical. I think, our systems, both for shelter and housing assistance and any kind of public assistance, are kind of based on this assumption that given a little bit of temporary help, people will then get back up on their feet and be able to sustain themselves. And that's just not the economic reality we're living in. I think, as Yoko pointed out in her question, Hawaii is one of the most, housing is so costly in Hawaii. The cost of living is extraordinarily high. Maya mentioned in the introduction that we have the largest gap between wages and cost of living of any state in the country. And so it's not a temporary kind of situation where a little bit of help for 90 days or 2 years will then somehow allow someone to dramatically increase their income to the point where they can afford to live in Hawaii. So we've really got to get creative, and on top of that kind of fundamental macroeconomic issue, government also faces two other big challenges. The first is the cost of creating truly affordable housing or subsidizing people permanently to be in housing that already exists. And the second is NIMBYism. So anytime you propose any kind of permanently affordable housing for people on the lowest end of the income scale, you get this kind of knee-jerk reaction of neighborhoods saying, we don't want that here, not in my backyard-ism. And so that's where really it's the role of community. It's the community's kuleana to kind of address those issues. And that's part of the reason I'm so hopeful about models like Pu'uhonua o Waianae, or like the folks that we work with on Sand Island, who are houseless folks that are organizing themselves, practicing living as a community together, and a way of supporting each other and thriving that doesn't rely necessarily on public assistance or institutions or having enough money to buy what you need. But when you're able to work together as a community and then connect houseless and housed folks, then a whole range of other solutions becomes possible. Those two communities that I mentioned, those houseless communities that I mentioned, are now working to plan and build their own tiny home villages in places that are still connected to a surrounding neighborhood. And they're able to do that because they've built a track record of being contributors to the neighborhood that they live in. And so that helps address both the cost issue, because if you're able to live well as a community, you can build communal housing, which costs less because you can do things like share bathrooms and kitchens and a gathering hall. So it brings the development costs down. But it also helps address the NIMBYism, because if you have people that can function as a community and a houseless encampment that is contributing, is showing that they're contributors to their wider neighborhood, then you also tackle that NIMBYism issue. So it's not all on government to create those long-term solutions. There's definitely a role for the community as well.
Thank you, James. We're going to jump right back to Liam before we finish off with a question for Maya. Liam, the question for you is, can you share some examples of recommendations from your work with the Oakland Task Force that capture what it looks like to reimagine public safety?
Yeah, thanks for that. And it's good to focus on positive solutions for change. I always say that we have a tendency, as at least in the community organizing, to describe the problem for 90% of the time, and then 10% of the time is the solution. But let's get to solutions. So we had 88 recommendations that were passed by the task force. The City of Oakland, the council adopted all 88 and prioritized 12 for this upcoming year. And I'll just share what some of those are. I think I mentioned earlier, as a response to people in crisis broadly, there's a new program that sends out an EMT and a crisis responder. So these are what are, like when I said earlier, only 4% of 911 calls relate to violent crime. There's a massive body of calls that involve people in crisis. So these teams can go out and give care to people that need it, and they're trained in that. Transferring traffic enforcement out of the police department into the Department of Transportation, having unarmed civilian staff issuing what are routine traffic stop tickets and so forth, as well as taking accident reports. That's a huge amount of police time. So that's a big one. Restorative justice infrastructure. We know that restorative justice is a very community-based approach to dealing with conflict and harm, and helping victims and people who have harmed them to really bring true accountability and healing. It's been used for example, as a way to divert youth out of the criminal justice system. So we proposed building out that infrastructure in Oakland so that communities across the city would have resources to participate in restorative justice. Decriminalization was a big part of our recommendations. Decriminalizing homelessness, lying on sidewalks, existing in public, as we call them, different things that essentially for being houseless, or poor, you're criminalized. Decriminalizing substance abuse, so drug possession, as well as sex work. And so these were put forward. Demilitarizing the police was a recommendation, and another that I really feel strongly about was building out an army of violence interrupters. There are programs across certain places in California that have been very successful in essentially hiring men from the community who have been previously involved with violence or gangs and so forth, who might have been incarcerated, when they come back into the community, to actually work with younger men who are getting involved with violence to help work them out of that space. And they bring major credibility. These violence interrupters, they're from the community, they know it, and they're trusted. So that's another good one. And then I think lastly, we just looked at investing in the root causes of crime and violence and poverty, which are workforce development, living wage jobs, stable housing, the things that we know, as I said earlier, most definitely have the biggest impact on reducing crime and violence. So those are just a few, but I encourage you to go to the City of Oakland website for Reimagining Public Safety. You can look at the report, all 88 recommendations, many of which I think are very relevant for Hawaii.
Scott, can I just add something briefly to what Liam shared? Because I think it applies both to community policing and restorative justice, as well as homelessness. And that is, so much of getting to good solutions is about who's at the table when the solutions are being created, and that the communities that are directly impacted by the policies need a seat at the table. And the other thing that Liam started the podcast with actually is that there's so many great models out there in our communities, because communities that have been failed by these institutions have had to come up with their own solutions anyway. And so we should be looking to those places for our solutions and bringing them in as full partners, whether it's housing or homelessness or community policing or any of our intractable problems.
Absolutely.
Great. Thank you, Liam. Thank you, James. And Maya, gosh, if the first 2 episodes are any indication of how amazing the entire series will be, then I'm really, really excited for what's to come. I listen to most podcasts on like 1.5 or 2 times the speed, but I found myself listening to Liam's and James in real time because they're just so thoughtful and rich with information. So I'm going to ask you, Maya, the question that I think everyone else is wondering: what's next for the series?
Thank you for that. I agree with you. They are remarkable people, and there are more remarkable people who are joining us in the next episodes. These are thoughtful change makers. They're doers, they're creators, they're creatives. They are passionate people, full of conviction about the work that they do, teeming with good ideas, and they are creating real impact right now on tough issues, and issues of policy, of culture, of community, variously defined. So we have upcoming episodes that tackle race and restorative justice and healing. after violence. We have episodes that look at environmental justice and nature-based solutions and indigenous wisdom and much more. So we are, I think, going to be hearing about a lot of solutions that will apply to our educational systems, our families, our relationships, and that will hopefully encourage us each to delve deeply, to mine our own interiors, to stay engaged and stay hopeful. So I hope that all of you listeners, whether you are joining us live or more likely listening to this conversation later, I hope you'll stay involved and join us on this journey and stay engaged and invite others. I'm terrible about promoting these conversations, but they really are conversations that matter. And so please invite others to join, to listen in, and then talk with others about what you together can do in community to reshape expectations and build a stronger tomorrow. We will be having a listening party, I should tell you, for the next 2 episodes next month. So I hope you'll also join us for that. And thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Maya. Thank you so much for creating this platform for us to listen and learn and inspire us to take action on such important topics that our community faces. And Maya's not doing this alone. There's someone behind the scenes, Stephanie Eisenstadt, and her husband, Ari, as well. They've been doing a lot of the behind the scenes work with KTUH. I'd love to turn it over to you, Stephanie, to add some closing remarks.
My heart is just so full. I'm so excited to be with all of you. It's been a thrill to flip back and forth of all of the live streams with our partner organizations and to engage in the conversations there. So thank you so very much, not only to these incredible guests who helped bring this dream come true, to our incredible partners, the organizations that you follow them and engage with them, because we are all truly engaged in doing the work that's behind these important issues, to our friends at the studio, at KTUH and others. Thank you so much for all of the labor of love that has gone into helping us come together and deliver these conversations and food for thought to the world, everyone who's contributed their input and their ideas and their participation. So we're just so grateful for the opportunity to be connected during these times and to be engaged. I love what you said, Tatiana. You were reflecting in the various chats about your experiences growing up and how you enjoyed the DARE programs and how important it is to engage young people. And I remember being an elementary school student, a young activist growing up in the NAACP and now serving as a trustee nationally with the NAACP Foundation. As young people participating in programs like Ceeds of Peace programming and others, we learn that these critical issues aren't just headlines. They're not just issues of the day. They are social, critical human rights issues that are affecting lives, and that we as young people and we as ordinary folks growing up in our communities and members of our families can use opportunities like just a conversation around dinner or conversations with friends or comments on social media and otherwise to help shine an important spotlight, not just on the challenges, but on the solutions. So thank you so much to our incredible hosts, one of my biggest role models and an inspiration to me for helping to have the vision and foresight to bring this conversation to life for all of us to see things differently and most importantly to engage. So with that being said, to listen to the full conversations, because I know how challenging it was for us to get just a 10-minute snippet during this program here today, please head over to SoundCloud. We've got the link in the description of this program. So if you're watching right now or you're watching later, these are available on demand, soundcloud.com/KTUH sets and then Bravethrough. It's also available wherever you get your podcasts. So just look for KTUH, search for Bravethrough, and you'll find us there. For those of you who would like to listen live, we've got another exciting episode coming. We're here on Fridays at 8 a.m. local time in Honolulu on ktuh.org and 90.1 FM. So please join us, as she said, next month for the next installment of Bravethrough Live. And don't forget to read the fine print. We have some resources provided by each of our guests to help you learn and be inspired and take action around these topics. So that is available to you, the listener guide in the podcast description. Scott, thank you so very much. And to Seeds of Peace, to Matsunaga Peace Studio, Institute for Climate Peace, KTUH, for partnering with us to bring this conversation live. We look forward to seeing you again next month.
Thank you all. Thank you, Z. Love you guys.
Thanks, everybody.
Mahalo, everybody. Mahalo.
Thanks for being with us.